This video is not intended for children under the age of 13 and is intended for older fans. Viewer discretion is advised. There, kids and parents, you've been warned. Now get off my fucking lawn! So it's been a while since I recorded at all, and I said I'd do a ranking of Season 2 of Thomas if the ranking of Season 1 got 500 views, and, well, it did. So I guess enough people want to see what I think of Season 2. So yeah, we're ranking Season 2 of Thomas and Friends. I have a lot of fond memories with this season. A lot of the memories I can recall as a kid were from watching this season, and I think I watched this one the most along with Season 5. I think I was able to watch most of the classic Thomas seasons that were released before the hit era, but I can recall watching Season 2 in particular a lot as a kid. But yeah, after the pretty solid beginning that was the first season, Season 2 really amped it up with the production, expanding upon Sodor and adding new characters, as well as developing the ones introduced in the previous season. But I got a little Caesar's order to go pick up later, so with all that said, let's rank all of Season 2 of Thomas and Friends.
You've denied me access to chicken nuggies.
Okay, so I don't think Season 2 has any outright bad episodes, but these first two on the list are definitely what I consider the least good. So I think the beginning is quite good and sets up Thomas getting a big head pretty well, but the outcome is my issue. Thomas may have been conceited at the beginning, but he really wasn't to blame for what happened, so why is it Thomas who was reprimanded and not the careless cleaner? The narrator also says that Thomas realized his mistake while he was moving, so why didn't Thomas say anything about the cleaner when he was getting reprimanded? One of my pet peeves with the show is that sometimes Sir Topham Hatt just reprimands the wrong characters when they're not at fault. But the lady getting pissed about her breakfast being ruined and not her house getting destroyed is pretty damn funny, and it's nice to see Donald and Douglas in this episode. It's also impressive to see the crash with the house, which definitely shows that there's an increase of a budget since now they can build models that they can destroy on set to simulate train crashes. This may be the lowest ranked episode, but again, I don't think any of these episodes in this season are bad.
Hello, hi, I'm Bertie, hello.
I think most people agree that this is the worst episode of the season, but I think it's okay. Sure, it's kind of a nothing story, but I think it has some nice character moments. Thomas and Bertie's relationship is nice to see again, showing more of their friendly rivalry, and despite the arguments they can get into, they're still willing to help each other. Also, that exchange with Thomas and Henry, it's just hilarious. This season is Thomas at his jerkiest, and I am all here for it. He is not having anyone's shit this season. And since this is the first episode I'm talking about that has it, the Viaduct is easily one of the best sets of the season and even the whole show, and the track that plays along with it is definitely my favorite non-character track from this season. But yeah, story isn't the best and nothing big really happens. It's just kind of a whatever episode.
Hey Percy, I burnt the water.
And just like with my ranking of Season 1, the first episode of Season 2 is also pretty low. But this is a good way to start off the season since we can get a good look at the dynamic with Thomas, Percy, and Toby. We see Thomas and Percy's rivalry, but we also see at the end with them making up with each other that they really do care about one another despite their quarrels. Speaking of quarrels, please go watch Cold Quarrels. It is so good. And Toby is just in the middle enjoying the chaos. Unfortunately, we don't get to see Toby in this season a whole lot, but it's nice that we get to see what Toby is like in this dynamic. It's nice to see the coal falling on Thomas and getting him dirty. Sure, Season 1 let the engines get dirty also, but not to this extent. Really shows here that the show is getting more advanced in the production and technical side and will continue to do so in later seasons, especially Season 5. And of course, I have to bring up the fact that if it weren't for this episode, we wouldn't have the "it was time for Thomas to leave. He had seen everything" meme. So while it does show how this season is going to be more advanced than Season 1, overall, I don't have much else to say about it. It's fine.
If you must know, my name's Bruce. Don't care, come on!
I don't know if some people will disagree with this, but this is definitely my least favorite part of the Duck and Diesel trilogy. But that doesn't mean I dislike this episode. It's the second part of a 3-episode story, and while the ending is sad, that's not really why this is my least favorite episode of the trilogy. First episode had us meet Diesel, the third episode, well, I'll just save that for when we talk about it, and this episode had Diesel get the big engines to turn on Duck, and honestly, it's just not as interesting as the other two. Will say though, it wasn't until I started learning history about trains that I realized that the galloping sausage line from Gordon was a reference to the Hush Hush, which is actually one of my favorite steam engines. And considering the history of that locomotive, it's no wonder Gordon was pissed off about that. But yeah, Diesel is pretty interesting in the fact that he's the first outright villainous character in the show. Sure, an episode will usually have an antagonist, but they're never outright villainous in those episodes. Diesel frames Duck and gets the others to turn on him, and none of the other engines did something like that before this episode. There's also the fact that he's one of the first Diesels introduced in the show, one of 3 Diesel engines to be introduced in this season in fact. So while I may not like this episode as much as the other 2 episodes in this trilogy, it really shows how villainous Diesel is.
Skibbity, skibbity, hawk to a ha.
A nice Christmas episode, and I'd say it's better than the Christmas episode from season 1. Like I said in the ranking of the first season, I love winter settings, and the sets for this season look beautiful with all the snow. The story isn't too complex, it's just Thomas delivering a Christmas tree and getting stuck in the snow, and Donald and Douglas coming to save him. I absolutely love the visual gag of Thomas blowing the snow off himself after getting rescued. It's pretty funny. The ending is also sweet with all the characters together, but I honestly have nothing else to say. It's definitely a Christmas episode.
Keep my country's names out your fucking mouth!
Now here's an episode that's more exciting than some of the previous ones. It's also the first episode on the list that has Harold play a role in a story, and Harold is a very welcome addition to the show. His theme is easily one of my favorite character themes in the show, and I love hearing it when it plays in the show. But when Thomas becomes a runaway, I love how seriously this situation is taken. Everyone in the episode plays their part to warn about Thomas's situation, and that's how a work environment should be. Unfortunately, this episode had to reuse footage from season 1. It's not really something I have an issue with, it's just hard not to notice it as an adult now. Also, just want to say here, I love this set here. Like, this shot right here with Duck crossing this bridge with Annie and Clarabelle. Ugh, I love it so much. Like, any shot with this set is so damn good. But overall, I don't really have anything else to say about this episode. I don't have anything relevant to this cutaway, so, bazinga. I know some people don't like this episode, but I think it's alright. I think it's mainly due to Thomas being confused about Trevor and if he's actually capable of work when he's already met road vehicles before. Some people bring up that it doesn't make sense since Thomas is friends with Terrence and Birdie, but I think I would chalk that up to Thomas never meeting a traction engine before. In season 2, Thomas is still kind of a child. Like in season 1, if he was in the child mindset, season 2 is kind of where he's in the preteen or early teen phase. Starting to learn more, but still prone to making mistakes and is still pretty ignorant about the world, if that makes sense. Anyway, the story is a nice follow-up to the episode that introduced Trevor, although the fact Thomas has the same derpy looking smile throughout is just odd. Like, the narrator said Thomas was eyeing Trevor doubtfully, but Thomas is smiling in this scene. Like, why? Did Thomas's other faces get lost while filming this episode? But I do like Trevor. He's not my favorite character to be introduced in this season, but he's a nice addition to the cast. But yeah, other than Thomas's face, I don't have much issues with this episode.
You're not killing a cow, Gordon. That was a joke? Yes.
And here's an episode that's more humorous. It's also one of the first episodes in the ranking where Edward plays a bigger role here. This season is very Edward focused, and I'm all here for it since Edward might be my favorite character in the show. But yeah, Henry and Gordon interacting with Bluebell and trying to get her off the rails is funny, and I like with Henry saying, "I don't want to hurt her," is kind of foreshadowing Henry's love for animals and nature that we'll see in season 3. It most likely wasn't intentional, I just thought this was interesting. Also nice to see Toby stick up for Edward. Honestly, given that they're 2 of the oldest characters on Sodor, I'm surprised Edward and Toby don't interact a whole lot. Considering they're 2 different types of old man characters also, I feel like they could have some pretty fun interactions. It's also pretty satisfying to see Edward get his own back at Henry and Gordon at the end of the episode. So yeah, this one is pretty funny.
Up yours, Percy!
This season isn't just Edward focused, it also really put Percy into the spotlight. This episode introduces Harold, and he's a very welcome addition to the cast. We already have a couple of road vehicle characters, so why not have an air vehicle character? While he does have a lot of heroic moments in the show later on, Harold can get a pretty big head, literally looking down on the engines from the sky. And this can get annoying for a character like Percy. I could see Thomas being used for the story, but I'm glad they used Percy instead. The race is pretty thrilling, especially with the music and the dialogue from the driver encouraging Percy, but I don't think it's as fun as something like Thomas and Bertie's Great Race. But I wouldn't skip this if I was watching a Thomas playlist or DVD. It's definitely not my favorite Percy episode from this season, but hey, Percy is one of my favorites anyway.
And the moral of the story is, don't fuck with the duck.
And now the episode that introduces everyone's favorite Great Western engine, Duck. Unless you like Oliver more. But we aren't there yet, so... But I really like Duck. He's definitely one of my favorite characters to be introduced in this season. Plus, he was actually one of the first Bachman Thomas models I got a few years ago. Off topic, I know, but he's easily one of my favorite models from the Bachman Thomas line. Anyway, the story is great. It takes place after Percy and the Signal, and Percy is still thinking of a way to pay out the big engines for tricking him. And his chance comes in the form of Duck. It's nice to see Duck show Percy how to stand up for himself, and they have a nice dynamic. Percy and Duck is a fun character pairing, and it's a shame that after season 3 they never really touched this dynamic a whole lot. And of course I have to bring up the silence from the UK narration. That booming tone of voice from Ringo really emphasizes how much of an authority figure Sir Topham Hatt is. But I would also like to say the quacking and wheezing from George Carlin while the big engines are teasing Duck is hilarious. And since this is the first episode with Duck, I gotta say, I really like his theme. So yeah, first episode with Duck is good.
No, that's not how it works.
You told me to do it, not do it correctly.
And another Edward episode. This episode introduces Scrap in the show, and it's a good way to introduce it to this world. Trevor is a pretty nice character. Like every other character introduced in this season, he feels like a natural inclusion to the show, especially with how the story goes about introducing Scrap. The last season didn't really go into Scrap, so it's nice to see season 2 delve into this topic. When Edward first meets Trevor and he says he's going to be broken up, it's pretty clear that Scrap is death for these characters, but it still feels tasteful enough for the target audience. But fortunately for Trevor, Edward helps him out since he's also old but can see that Trevor still has a lot of life in him. And it's really sweet to see Trevor get another chance at life and be able to work again. Also love the line that says Edward doesn't care about the comments about his age. No matter how old he gets, Edward will always be ready to work and do his best regardless. And that's a really good lesson to take away from Edward, is that just because you're old, it shouldn't stop you from doing your best. So yeah, this episode is quite solid.
Someone better save me or I will sue this wretched railway!
The episode that takes place after Thomas comes to breakfast, and the next episode to introduce a Diesel character, Daisy. Daisy is interesting in the fact that, unlike Diesel, she isn't really a bad Diesel, but she's more so pretty snooty. If Diesel represents the worst of Diesels and another engine who we haven't talked about yet represents the best of Diesels, hint hint, Daisy is in the middle. She's rude to Annie, Clarabelle, and Henrietta, annoys Percy and Toby, and she refuses to pull a milk tanker, but none of this is done out of malice. She's just stubborn and entitled.
I don't talk to ugly people.
Ma'am, I need you to have a seat before we can land.
Well, then I guess this fucker's gonna stay in the sky. La la la. I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe. I will sit where I want. I want to sit here.
Oh, you cannot sit there.
I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe. I'll do what I feel like. No. I mean, I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe.
But the violent shaking and sudden lurch is pretty funny, and when George Carlin is like, feeble, I just love it. George is really good this season. He might be at his best here during his time as narrator for the show. But it really is a shame that Daisy doesn't show up a whole lot during this era of the show, since the director of Shining Time Station thought she was sexist, because I think Daisy is a fun character. Especially given the fact that she is snooty not because of her Diesel heritage, but because of her own entitlements. But I guess that's where the fandom comes in, because when Mattel or whoever is in charge of the show drops the ball, the fans pick it up.
You should scrap yourself now!
The story for this isn't anything special, but man, the sets and shots from this episode are just amazing! I love nighttime in the show, and this is easily one of the best looking episodes of the season. The shot with Edward crossing the viaduct during the night always stood out to me as a kid, and I love the station. All the people there and all the talking and stuff that's going on in the background, it looks really busy. The line of Edward saying Gordon could always take Boko's trucks is funny, and makes it even funnier when Boko shows up at the end of the episode to get Bill and Ben to leave Gordon alone. Boko was a cool character, and I love the fact they introduced him in this season along with Diesel so that the audience can see that not all Diesels are bad. I just wish he got to appear in the show more. But again, that's when the fans come in. I also adore the face where Gordon just slunks back into the station. He just looks so embarrassed. So while it may not have the most exciting story, this episode really shows how beautiful season 2 looks at night, and that's partly why it's higher than some of the others.
What the hell is that? That's not an engine, that's a caterpillar on wheels. Where's the rest of it?
And here's the second to last episode of the season. After the last episode, Percy is pretty cocky about his ghost prank, and Thomas gets so fed up he just roasts him. And low-key, it's pretty satisfying. To go back to the technical side of this season, the treacle falling on Percy is definitely an upgrade from James bumping into tar tankers and the tar splattering on him in the next shot. Sure, we saw James crash into the tankers, but we didn't actually see the tar splash on James. The dynamic with Thomas, Percy, and Toby is once again highlighted here, and it also shows how much of a neutral agent of chaos Toby is. He helped Percy with the ghost prank on Thomas in the last episode, and now he joins Thomas in laughing at Percy's misfortune. I just love Toby. He's definitely become one of my favorites in recent years. So yeah, this one was pretty funny.
What's the point of that? So the bureaucrats can justify their jobs.
Yet another Percy episode. This episode was definitely Percy at his most malicious, and I love it. Last season, it was Thomas pulling tricks and pranks on the big engines. Now it's Percy pulling the strings. I particularly love the scene where James is getting reprimanded by the inspector. Then once the inspector tells him that Sir Topham Hatt is away, and then James is like, oh, where's Percy? I just love the realization James has. It's also pretty funny and satisfying to see Gordon and James get back at Percy by telling him about quote-unquote backing signals, and then Percy falls for it. Pretty good lesson to not be annoying to coworkers or cause problems for the work environment. Another good episode with Percy.
If you swallow it, I'll go vegan for a year. Deal.
Now we're getting to the ones I'd consider my favorites, and this one here has gotten this high mainly because of nostalgia. I have a lot of fond memories with this episode since I remember watching this episode a lot as a kid, and it was one of my favorite Percy episodes. While my opinion on it has waned over the years, I still find it very enjoyable to watch. This is easily the most over-the-top crash this season. I mean, Percy destroys a brake van and then ends up on top of a freight car it was coupled to. When doing research on this, I didn't think this was actually inspired by a real-life accident, but it was. I legit didn't know something like this was actually possible. Also nice to see some development from Daisy, but unfortunately, we don't get to see Daisy deal with a bull until season 4. Yeah, I know I said in the previous ranking I wasn't a big continuity snob with this show, and I still don't think I am, but it's hard not to notice the continuity is pretty messy. But one issue I have is Sir Topham Hatt scolding Percy when the accident wasn't completely his fault. Sure, Percy was rough with the trucks, but they're the ones who caused the crash. But yeah, I'm definitely biased here since I have a lot of fond memories with this episode, but this is my ranking.
With that, Bertie sped off as fast as he could and was picked up for drunk driving.
Here's another episode with Edward, and he's paired with Bertie of all characters. Not really a character pairing you'd expect, eh? This doesn't really have a lesson or have anything big going on, it's just Bertie trying to catch up with Edward. And you know what? That's all it needs. The story's simplicity really helps the episode. It's nice to see another episode with Bertie, this time not racing another engine, but this time trying to catch up to Edward to deliver Thomas's passengers. It's nice to see more of Bertie's character, showing that he'll go through a lot of lengths for Thomas. Also, the music for this episode is really good. It's just so enjoyable to listen to and is definitely a step up from Bertie's theme in season 1. I'm just gonna say here now, season 2 soundtrack is definitely a step up from season 1. So yeah, definitely one of my favorites from season 2.
I like trains.
Now, here's the last part of the Duck and Diesel trilogy. And man, what a conclusion this episode is. Duck may have tricked Diesel in the first part, but this episode here shows that Duck is quite a hero. It's nice to see Duck and Edward working together at the beginning, and Duck coasting down the hill looks so satisfying. The situation here is really drastic, and Duck does his absolute best to prevent a worse outcome with the trucks going as fast as they are. And when he crashes into the barbershop, it's pretty funny seeing Duck's face here and really get a perspective with how big these engines are compared to the people. Some will say the ending to the Diesel plotline is underwhelming, but I think it's actually pretty good. Diesel is a pretty nasty character, and like some people we've known in our life, some characters don't deserve a definitive send-off. I mean, sure, we see Diesel again in the show, but I think it's still a good end to this arc. Especially considering Diesel was intended to be a one-off character in the books. I don't know, I still haven't read the Railway series. So yeah, it's a great conclusion to the Duck and Diesel trilogy and overall a great episode.
This has to be a violation of the Geneva Convention. We're not in Geneva.
Now we finally get to an episode that focuses on my favorite characters that were introduced this season, Donald and Douglas. These two are easily my favorite twin characters in the show, and it's always nice to see them in an episode. I love how Donald and Douglas just don't take shit from anyone. Such as Donald shoving the brake van to get him to behave, and Douglas throwing a dig at James by bringing up his incident back in Dirty Objects. Really love that line in particular, since not only is it a hilarious dig at James, but Dirty Objects is one of my favorite episodes from the last season. The Spiteful Brakeman is also interesting in the fact that he's the first individual rolling stock character in the show to play an actual role in an episode. I love how Donald shoving the brake van shows that he and Douglas will always look out for each other and will stick up for one another, whatever situation they're in. And when the brake van gets crushed, sure, it's overkill, but considering all the trouble he's been causing for Douglas and presumably some of the other engines, he low-key had it coming. And the ending gets you on the edge of your seat for the next episode. After this episode, you don't want the twins to be separated. So yeah, a fantastic introduction to two of my favorite characters from the show. Also, the black liveries look better than the blue liveries. Don't at me.
Diesel isn't completely useless. He can be used as a bad example.
The first part of the Duck and Diesel trilogy, and this is my favorite of the three because I love how it introduces Diesel. And we also get to see more of Duck's character here. When Diesel is acting all high and mighty, Duck pulls a trick on him, and while this episode showed that while Diesel may be boastful, Duck stooped to a low to sabotage Diesel by not telling him about the condition of the trucks. While Diesel may be a nasty character, Duck really isn't a saint in this episode either. But what makes Diesel interesting in the fact that he isn't just the first antagonistic engine in the show, but also the first Diesel. Times are changing in the world, and since Diesels were regarded as superior to steam engines when they were first introduced to the world, it would make sense that Diesel as well as some other Diesels would get big heads from all this praise. And Duck decides to knock him down a peg. Like in the previous episode he was in, and also in a close shave for Duck, Duck will usually take things into his own buffers. He would definitely be the type of kid who would get sent to the principal's office for getting in fights with bullies. Also, Diesel trying to pull the trucks is pretty funny, and I have to bring up Ringo Starr's narration for this scene. The growl he does for Diesel and the moans he does for the old trucks are hilarious. So yeah, I really like this one.
Yeah, well, it was nice to meet you, Polly.
Now here's one I have a lot of fond memories with. I watched Best of Percy a lot as a kid, and I remember loving this episode a lot. It's also the first episode where we get to see Bill and Ben. Will say though, it's weird that Percy is telling them about his experience in Percy's Promise, which is season 3, but again, continuity in this show is weird. I like that it's Thomas who warns Percy about the sign and what can happen if you don't follow the rules. Sure, Thomas can be a jerk this season, but this shows here that he's slowly becoming more responsible from how he was in the last season. I don't know why the water looks like that, but regardless, this is the first time we've seen an engine fall into water. I also love the scene where Percy is being lifted onto a flatbed. As you already know, I love how night looks in this show, and this is no exception. Oh hi, Diesel. Also, just gotta say, the harbor looks so damn good. The shed, all the boats, cranes, the parts, all the buildings around. This might be the best set from the season. It really looks like a place from the real world. Also love how the rails here are sloping down to the sea, foreshadowing Percy's accidents. So yeah, I loved this episode back then, and I still love it now.
That's right, keep moving.
This is all your fault, Bill.
Shut up, Ben, it's your fault.
Now here's an episode I don't think I got to watch a whole lot as a kid. but watching it now as an adult, I think I would have liked this one a lot as a kid. This is also the only episode with Bill and Ben as the main characters this season, and that's unfortunate because they're quite funny. It's also the first episode that has Boko in it, and when they introduce him, at first you think he'll be another bad Diesel like, well, Diesel, but then it turns out that Boko is actually pretty nice. It was a pretty good move to introduce Boko in this season along with Diesel so that we can see that not all Diesels are bad. Bill and Ben may be naughty and mischievous, but they're not so obnoxious to the point of being unlikable. Plus, the way they get so scared when their drivers say they're going to go get their trucks back is just so damn funny. The prank Bill and Ben pull on Boko is also pretty funny, especially the face Boko makes when he realizes that there's two of them. The China Clay Works isn't my favorite set in the show, but I like how it looks and it does serve its purpose, since it does look like a place for mining China clay. I also really like Bill and Ben's theme. It's definitely in my top 10 favorite character themes. So while the next one made me laugh more, I still found this episode pretty funny, and for that, it's rightfully in my top 5.
I will now make this coach filled with people disappear.
The sequel to Donald and Douglas, and it is such a satisfying end to this arc. To start off, if you remember, I love winter settings, and this is easily one of my favorite episodes with the winter setting. Donald and Douglas puffing through the snowy railway is just so satisfying. Like, this set in particular, it was already one of my favorites from the season, but the winter setting is so beautiful. This episode follows up from when Douglas destroys the spiteful brake van, and both twins are on the edge of their seats wondering who is going to be sent away. I love how despite how rude they can be to each other, the engines of Sodor always look out for their own when it comes to scrap. They really feel like a unit here. This episode might also have the funniest moment in the season. The moving camera here as it goes from left to right with the engine saying nothing as they try to think of something is just so damn funny. And the laughs don't end there with Percy delivering the deputation to Sir Topham Hatt. The stuttering and stammering he does feels so real and natural. And it ends with Sir Topham Hatt declaring that the twins will be staying on Sodor, and it is the second most satisfying moment in this season. So while I didn't get to watch this episode a whole lot as a kid, this episode's story, humor, winter sets, as well as Donald and Douglas definitely earns this episode a spot in my top 5 for this season.
James, touch my trucks and you will touch heaven.
Now here's an episode that has always been one of my favorites ever since I was a kid. Not only is this a good Edward episode, but it's also a good James episode. When James becomes a runaway without a driver, it's up to Edward to catch up to James and save him from, well, whatever will happen, it's not going to be good. Edward really pushes himself here, not as much as an episode we'll talk about later, but the expressions Edward makes while catching up to James with him being red in the face, you can really tell how tired Edward is. The chase overall is great. The rope swing back and forth as the inspector is trying to get a grip on James's buffer is so intense, even more so as an adult. This episode is the reason I know the runaway theme. It is the episode I always think about whenever I hear it. I love that Thomas and Percy stick up for Edward in this episode. Thomas makes sense since Edward was the only engine in season 1 he seemed to get along with, and with Percy, Edward was his mentor, so of course he would stick up for Edward. But in the end, James realizes how wrong he was with the experience he had and apologizes to Edward. Even if he'll talk shit about Edward when he's with Gordon and Henry, I think James really does respect Edward. So yeah, it's a fantastic episode for both Edward and James and is easily one of my favorite episodes from the show. I love these last 2 episodes equally, but I'm putting this episode in this spot because I just have more to say about the number 1 spot. That being said, this episode is more than deserving of being this high. This is easily the best Edward episode and shows here that despite how old he is, Edward will always be ready to work and will do anything to get a job done. Not just Edward, but also his crew. Edward's crew don't give up on him, like Edward refuses to give up working, and the crew do everything they can to help Edward. While Edward being old is still here, that's not all there is to his character like in the hit era. What truly defines Edward isn't his age, but his determination and iron will despite that age. The big engines, mostly Gordon, harass him for being old, but Edward never lets their comments get him down. I love that it's Boko and Duck sticking up for Edward here. Edward believed Duck back in a close shave for Duck and helped cheer him up, and as for Boko, Edward was one of the first friends Boko ever made on Sodor. So with that in mind, I'm glad they used Duck and Boko to defend Edward, especially since Thomas and Percy already stood up for him. And it ends with a line of Duck and Boko making sure Edward is left alone and Gordon and James remaining respectfully silent. That is the most satisfying moment of this season, easily. But to talk about the technical side, the way they lit the set here during the storm and the rumbling thunder shows how bad the weather is, and it's too bad they couldn't have rain dropping down on Edward, but hey, we'll get to something like that the next season. But I think this episode really embodies why I and so many other fans love Edward. He's a great role model, not only for children, but adults, to remind us that while we may be getting older, we can still have a lot to offer. And I think that's a really important lesson to take away from Edward. So yeah, I don't know what else I can say for this episode. It deserves all the praise it gets. So, let's get on to the number 1 spot. I don't think anyone would be surprised by this or Edward's exploit being so high, since they might be the most well-regarded episodes from this season. But I decided to put this above Edward's exploit for a reason I'll go into later. Anyway, everybody knows this episode. It's an episode that sticks with a lot of people for many good reasons. The main reason being that it's the first spooky episode of the show. Funnily enough, the story really isn't that scary. It starts with Percy telling Thomas and Toby about a ghost train that runs on the night of an accident as a warning to others. Thomas brushes off the story, and it turns out that story was a pretend story, and when Percy is making his way back to the sheds, Percy crashes into a cart of lime. Percy, covered from cap to buffer in lime, meets Toby up at a signal box, and the signalman brings up that they should clean Percy or else others would think he's a ghost. Percy gets an idea for a prank on Thomas, and Toby agrees to help. The prank ends up working and Thomas is spooked at the end, which leaves Percy and Toby to laugh it up. Gotta say though, Toby told Thomas that Percy basically died, so shouldn't Thomas be sad about his friend? Ah well, not every story is perfect. So yeah, the story itself isn't scary, but with the lighting, effects, fog, and music they used for this episode, they made it scary. Well, as scary as a children's show is allowed to be. The atmosphere in this episode is unlike any other episode of this season. The opening with the ghost engine is bone-chilling, and despite the model of it clearly being Percy's model with streamers attached, it really does a good job with spooking the viewer, but it's not too scary for its target audience. And of course I have to mention the narration when Percy spooks Thomas. Honestly, both Ringo and George did great in this part. They have a very spooky and eerie tone to their voice, but I gotta give it to George here. You can call me biased, but hey, I grew up with this narration. But even then, I just found the way he does the ghost voice for Percy more effective here. But another thing that makes this episode special, it's the first of the spooky episodes of the show. I think if it weren't for this episode, we wouldn't have episodes like Haunted Henry, Duncan Gets Spooked, and Stepney Gets Lost, which have inspired so many Thomas fan projects. You probably wouldn't expect that from a show about sentient trains, but here we are now. Who knows? Maybe I'll make a video about these fan stories. Also, I definitely didn't get this idea from another YouTuber. No. So yeah, this is definitely not a unique opinion, but Percy's ghostly trick might be my favorite episode of the season. But I'm indecisive as hell, so for now, I'll just say this and Edward's exploit are tied. So going into this ranking, I already love Season 2, but after talking about all these episodes in more detail than I've ever thought about, I've come to appreciate this season more. It's more of the same like Season 1, but so much more now that they have more of a budget, which means more characters and better looking sets and props. I don't necessarily think it's the peak of the show, but this was definitely an upgrade from Season 1 in terms of everything. If I were to make a top 20 favorite Thomas episodes like T1, E2, H3 did, there'd probably be a lot of Season 2 episodes. It might even be in my top 3 favorite seasons of the show. But we still gotta rank the next 5 seasons of the classic era anyway, so we'll see if that changes. So with all that said, I don't know if I want to rank Tugs yet. I feel like that has to be a milestone video, so for now I'll just say, I'll see you guys next time for when we rank Season 3. But the lady getting pissed about her breakfast getting ruined and not her house being... Damn it. But the lady getting pissed about her breakfast getting ruined and not her house getting destroyed is pretty damn funny. And it's nice to see Fuck! But this is a good way to start off the season since we can get a good look at the dynamic with Thomas. Daisy is interesting in the fact that, unlike Diesel, fuck! Last season it was Thomas pulling tricks and pranks on the big... Fuck! It's nice to see Duck and Edward working together at the beginning, and Dust what? Will say though, it is weird that Polly is... Did I just say Polly? Oh no.